Professor, thank you for coming on the Mother of All Talk shows again. You're most cooperative, I must
Thank
say.
you, George.
They're getting closer and closer to you. Do you think Iran is the big enchilada, that all of this is an encroachment, an encirclement, or are there, as it were, non-Iranian linked issues at play in the US-UK attack on Yemen?
Obviously, Iran is not going to change its policy. Iran will continue to support the resistance in Yemen, in Gaza, in Lebanon, and Iraq and Syria. And no amount of escalation is going to change that. Iran has been under maximum pressure sanctions for many years now. And the reason for those maximum pressure sanctions is Iran's policy towards Palestine. If Iran were to compromise with the West on Palestine, all of these sanctions would be gone. But there's a principle that the Iranians have always stated, and they've always believed in, and they will continue to pursue, and that is that apartheid in the whole of Palestine must come to an end. And the Israelis, they have to set aside this regime where Palestinians are considered to be subhuman and where other Palestinians are expelled from their land and where we see Palestinians killed regularly. So these sanctions, the pressure against Iran is linked to this. Iran will continue to stay the course, but I don't think really the United States is in a position to escalate too far. And the reason is that Yemen is not the Yemen of 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. Just like in Gaza, we see a new capability in the resistance where they've been able to humiliate the Israeli regime. In previous battles, that's not how things went. The Israelis would batter Gaza, they would massacre people, and then the Gazans would maybe hit a tank or two, fire a few rockets, which would usually be stopped by the Iron Dome. But now we see that Gaza, despite the atrocities, despite the genocide, despite what the Holocaust, they have been able to defeat the Israelis on the battlefield. Now, Gaza, this extraordinary defense capability, these underground tunnels that have been created, they are something which the Israeli regime doesn't know how to deal with. So imagine what it is like for the Americans against Yemen. I've spoken to a couple of people who know a good deal about what's going on in Yemen, and they said that the American airstrikes had no impact on the defense capabilities of the Yemeni armed forces, or Ansarullah, or what the Americans like to call the Houthis, or Westerners call the Houthis. Ansarullah, or the Yemeni army defenses, are underground, and they are not accessible to the United States. They will come out, do what they need to do, and then go back to their many underground tunnels. And it is a huge country, a mountainous country, and it's no comparison. There's no comparison between Yemen and Gaza. And then, of course, there's Lebanon. The Israelis keep saying that they're going to take out Hezbollah, but they don't, because they know they cannot win a war there. So I find it highly unlikely that the Americans would expand the war all the way to the Persian Gulf. That won't happen, most probably. Of course, madmen can do anything, but I'm assuming they're not that mad, because the resistance would take a new form in Iraq. It would take a new form in Syria. And of course, all those countries that host American bases in the Persian Gulf region would be hostile. And all of their assets are right alongside the Persian Gulf coast. So I find it very hard to believe that the Americans would push it that far, especially as the war in Ukraine is still ongoing and the tensions with China, especially after the elections in Taiwan, are probably not going to get any better. I think that although I do believe that escalation, we are moving towards escalation, but I think the sort of escalation that you may have been alluding to in your question is further off.
The attacks, though, were substantial. A lot of assets. The German Navy is arriving in the Red Sea. What could possibly go wrong? A German warship on the move into the Red Sea. The UK and US are all guns blazing, even though there's not a shred of legal cover for it, not even a rubber-stamped British Parliament vote, never mind international law. Do you think it's just for show then? Or how serious is the Biden-Sunak war on Yemen?
Well, it could get very serious. First of all, I think we have to sort of go back a bit. When the Yemeni Navy warned ships not to go to Israeli ports, they would not target those ships unless they disobeyed. And they didn't sink any of those ships. They damaged them to force them to leave. No one was killed. And then the Americans went and massacred 10 young Yemeni sailors because they don't care. They don't care about human life, just wiping out families. They're like the Israelis. These people don't matter. So but the Yemeni armed forces imposed a blockade on Israel because of the genocide, because of Gaza. It didn't begin before the war in Gaza. It began after the genocide was taking all those lives. If the Americans and the British are so upset or so concerned about international shipping, well, just 3-4 years ago, ships that were taking fuel to Syria were constantly being attacked by the Israeli regime in the Mediterranean. So why weren't the Americans or the British worried about international shipping and security and global trade when Syrian ships were being attacked or Iranian ships taking fuel to Syria? So the issue is not international trade, because the Yemeni armed forces told everyone repeatedly that only ships that refuse to obey orders that are going to Israeli ports will be targeted. But now what the Americans have done because of the attack is that they forced the Yemeni armed forces to say that, okay, now American and British ships and those who are involved in the aggression and the violence in the Red Sea, those ships are no longer safe. So the Americans are pushing towards an escalation that will only get worse. And then if the Americans are humiliated and another ship is targeted, then they're going to have to escalate, at least in their warped worldview. They'll feel that they have to escalate, and then things will get out of control. This is something that I think you discussed from the beginning of the Gaza war, is that once war begins, as it expands, as it continues, it tends to expand. And then things happen which lead to reactions that cause escalation. And when things escalate, it becomes increasingly difficult to control the situation. So the Americans are pushing their luck. They're pushing the conflict towards a place where there may be major conflict in the Red Sea. And if that happens, I have no doubt that the Americans will fail. They cannot stop Yemen. Yemen has prepared itself for this. Why has Yemen prepared itself for this? Because for 7 years, the Saudis were bombing them day and night with American and British support. They've learned to build underground assets. They've learned to put everything in a safe place so that they cannot be bombed, because they've already experienced 7 years of airstrikes that were carried out with U.S. support. The Saudis spent over $200 billion fighting the war against Yemen, over $200 billion. And then, of course, we had the American hunger siege. They imposed a siege on Yemen, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Americans, preventing food from getting in. They imposed a starvation siege to bring the people of Yemen to their knees, and they failed. So how are a few Tomahawk missiles going to change the situation on the battlefield? How is it going to change the balance of power? The Yemenis have already prepared themselves for such a day.
I was involved in the Mavi Marmara, and my staff were on board the Mavi Marmara, the Turkish ship that was sailing with aid to the starving people in Gaza. Israel boarded the ship, killed 9 people, one of them a joint Turkish-American citizen. Nobody did anything about that act of piracy. And yet
8 o'clock.
the UK and the
And
US
where did they target the
have
ship?
gone to war in international waters.
Exactly. In
It is
international waters.
indeed. Professor, as always, a great pleasure, indeed an honor to interview you. Thanks for joining us on the Mother of
Thank you,
All
George.
talk shows.